This is the Vietnam lecture. This is going to really encompass more than just the 1950s and 60s. We're going to talk about Vietnam as kind of an encapsulated event of the Cold War. In fact, I mean, it is a crucial event. It's a nation-defining event in the same way that World War II is, or the Civil War, or the Revolutionary War. And so it's very important that you understand Vietnam in the context of tensions with the Soviet Union and really kind of the things that we've been talking about in the 50s and 60s with, nuclear weapons. Oh, we don't want nuclear weapons, so we're going to go to conventional weapons. But also the framing of NSC 68, this idea of military strength, of shaping democratic countries and that kind of thing. So there's a lot kind of wrapped up in Vietnam that gets us involved in that. And again, Vietnam, has this long, complex history. So this is it fits within the Cold War most clearly because it is definitely a piece of the Cold War. It's part of these terms that I've mentioned before, which is domino theory. This fear that if we let one country fall to communism, other countries will fall as well. It goes along with this notion of containment and that kind of thing. So it fits in with that. But it also has ramifications domestically as far as the protest movements. It definitely is a part of that and a part of the youth movements and the counterculture and that kind of thing. And it's definitely going to shape Richard Nixon's presidency. So we'll be talking about a lot of things and kind of looping back as we move through the civil rights movement and talk about Nixon and kind of address some of this stuff. But this is kind of the big picture of just Vietnam. If you look at, that the first map right here kind of shows you the location of Vietnam. This is Vietnam right here, okay? So here's Russia, China, there's Japan. So you get a sense of why Japan and our presence in Japan was so very important because of that proximity right there with Russia. But you also have Vietnam, very close to the Philippines. Philippines are independent. They're not a territory anymore, but we still have a naval base there. It's close to India, which is independent after World War II, but it's also, a major kind of market source for the United States as well as Australia. So we're going to be very concerned about this whole region right here, and it's linked to the Pacific Ocean. Understand too that Vietnam is a very different type of Asian country than say Korea. This was where Korea was, and you can see Korea is kind of up in the northern part. I mean, you're talking this is probably along the same latitude as what maybe Illinois roughly. Indiana, Ohio. So you're talking about places that can have really harsh winters. Whereas, Vietnam is much more southern. It's going to be, Texas, Mexico kind of latitude. And so it's going to be much hotter. And of course, it's jungle, so it's very steamy. So kind of understand kind of the geographic implications of Vietnam. And then I also want to be sure you understand that Vietnam was a French colony. Vietnam had gone through, unlike Korea that had always been in the shadow of China or Japan, especially Japan. What you see with French Indochina was this was a region that had been heavily influenced by China, but at various times had been influenced by kind of the area around Thailand and that kind of thing. And there had been a couple of brief periods where they had some independence. Often those were marked by lots of civil war. But you definitely see that this is part of what makes them ripe for French kind of colonization. And remember that it's not until World War II or the 1930s that China really stops to be influenced by Western powers. And so, China had all these spheres of influence. So it's very natural that France would have said, oh, well, here's Vietnam, right? Understand that in these territories of French Indochina, which include what is now Vietnam, but also Laos, Cambodia, and Cambodia. But they also divided Vietnam into Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin. And Annam and Cochin are going to be the areas where they have a lot of the rubber plantations, and that's kind of what French Indochina was known for. And so France really, relied on those rubber shipments. And it's really kind of interesting that after World War II, they're allowed to keep French Indochina. Which you would think, FDR, the Atlantic Charter, surely they would be, amenable to the Indo-Chinese kind of ruling themselves, but they're not, and that's because France desperately needs to have this kind of business, this kind of market resource. So you kind of have this picture of the way French Indochina looked, and then after independence, it's going to look like this, where you have Vietnam along this little strip, Cambodia is its own country. Oops, come back here. And then you're going to have Laos as its own country as well as Thailand. So be sure you understand that. Now, Cambodia, after the fall, or after Vietnam, is going to go through its own period of kind of dictatorship, the Khmer Rouge, and kind of what they call the killing fields of Cambodia. Really kind of brutal repression along the lines of China's fight against Western influence, where they basically try to purge society of anything that smacks of Westernization. But that's a whole different story. So be sure you kind of have that map kind of in your mind. When we talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, we're talking about this northern area up here. This is Hanoi, and what will become Ho Chi Minh City. No, I'm sorry, I lied. Ho Chi Minh City is going to be down here. This is where Saigon was. Because you can see here on this map, there's Saigon. So you've got these two capital cities, so be sure you kind of keep that in mind. So how does the Vietnam War start? Well, like I said, you have to really go back to the 1930s, right? A weak China, foreign influence, and then in the 1930s, the foreign influence gets weaker as Japanese influence gets stronger. Japan will occupy Vietnam during World War II. Matter of fact, they'll commit just the same kind of atrocities against the French who were still there and against the Vietnamese. And they'll kind of control that. Then during World War II, you'll have a nationalist movement begin that will very quickly, very similar to what we saw in China, where you have, of course, China's a little bit ahead of the curve. But you definitely see in China, you had a nationalist party and then a communist party, okay? And that same thing's going to happen in Vietnam. And Vietnam, of course, you don't have the success of the communists in fighting the Japanese in Vietnam like you do in China. But what will happen is that when the war's over and China falls to communism around 1948, what we're going to see is that because of the Truman Doctrine, this idea that we're going to help people resist communism, we're going to tend to shift a lot of resources to help the French hold on to Vietnam. Now, of course, like I said, this kind of violates this idea of free people being able to decide what the kind of government they wanted. There's not necessarily a logical consistency there, but you need to connect the end of World War II and kind of the nationalist versus communist movements, China being taken over by the communists, and the U.S. response to that, and the Korean War, and how, we didn't want China influencing Korea, so we sure don't want China influencing Vietnam. And so that means we're going to deal with the French, and we're going to help the French hold on to this place. Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader. He had actually advocated for an independent Vietnam after World War II. And he is a communist, but he's not a communist in the sense of a Soviet communist. In other words, he has no interest in being a Soviet satellite. What he wants is an independent Vietnam, and he believes communism is the answer, that Western influence and capitalism is part of the problem with Vietnam. So there's kind of this complicated economic backstory there with Vietnam. And remember that the French had used this as kind of a colonial economy. So you can see why the Vietnamese would be kind of, hesitant to support kind of the rich landowners, right? Because so many of the Vietnamese were very poor. But Ho Chi Minh was a big admirer of the United States, big admirer of the Declaration of Independence, and was very upset when the United States did not support Vietnamese independence after World War II. And so what he's going to start doing, especially after you have the communists in China getting control, because the Chinese communists are going to start kind of sending some weapons towards Vietnam, you're going to see Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh is what they're called. These are the communist forces in Vietnam. They're going to start basically a terrorist attack, a terrorist movement in Vietnam, and they're going to be fighting the French. But the French increasingly needs assistance to hold the Viet Minh back. And so that by the time you get to 1954, you can see right there, we're paying most of the bill. And so, this is where we have kind of this logical inconsistency about, do we support countries that want to be free and independent? But what if they want to be free and independent and support an idea that we don't like? Are we okay with that? Now, prior to the Cold War, we would have been like, yeah, whatever, right? Think about how we were with Germany. But after the Cold War, during the Cold War, we think very differently about, we want countries to have independence, but we want them to have independence the way we see it. And remember the impact of the Four Freedoms speech, right? That this is what democracy means, and this is how we define it. And so if you're going to be democratic, this is how it has to look. And kind of this emphasis on conformity there kind of with democracy. So it's very interesting. So be sure you kind of keep that in mind. So you're going to have this guerrilla war against the French. Dien Bien Phu, I don't think that's going to be a huge deal on the STAR test. 1954, it's a French town. And the Viet Minh basically kicked the French's butt, and the French are like, forget it, we're out. We're tired of doing this. So you're going to have this Geneva Accords in 1954, and this is going to divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel with the Ho Chi Minh and the communists in the north, and kind of a Western pro-nationalistic regime in the south. And remember, this is really built off. This is not long after we've divided Korea. Right, Korea's over in 1953, so we've done the same thing along the 39th parallel in Korea. So why not try it in Vietnam? And of course, what we know in the long run is that for Korea, it's still divided, right? And you have this communist nation that's kind of wheels off. Now Vietnam has a very different trajectory. Of course, Ho Chi Minh's a very different leader than the Kim family. The Kim family was always a little bit crazy. So Ho Chi Minh's agenda was very different. And this is the problem. We fail to understand that Ho Chi Minh is a different type of communist leader. We see communist and we immediately reject him without analyzing what kind of person he was, what kind of agenda he wanted, and really how much support he had within his country. Now, arguably, there are people in the southern part of Vietnam that are not excited about Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam, the part that had been most heavily influenced by the French because of the rubber plantations, was heavily Catholic, and so you had a lot of Catholics in South Vietnam. You had a lot of Western influence. You had a lot of Vietnamese businesses, and they were nervous about communism. And so it's not that Ho Chi Minh has unanimous support in Vietnam, but he definitely has support in the northern parts of Vietnam, and he has support among the poor all throughout Vietnam. And so this is going to be one of the issues that we see happening. The idea with the Geneva Accords in 54 is that there would be an election in 56 that would allow the Vietnamese people to decide what kind of government they want. Did they want to be under Ho Chi Minh? Did they want to have a democratic regime or whatever? And the leader of South Vietnam, Diem, who's got all the support from the U.S. So this support for democracy, and I'm using air quotes, in Vietnam was funded throughout, with Eisenhower throughout the 1950s. You get to the mid-1950s, and the French have pulled out. So now we're funneling all of our money, all of our weapons, all of our advisors into South Vietnam, right? And Diem really kind of opposes the Buddhist religion because he's a devout Catholic. And of course, Buddhism is kind of it's not Catholicism had more members than Buddhism did, but Buddhism was kind of the next major religious group, and it still represented a large group of Vietnamese. In addition, it had a profound influence among, especially in your rural areas, in your poor people. They tended to be more Buddhist. Also, Diem's regime was horribly corrupt. They were engaged in a lot of, kind of underhanded business deals, and they tended to take advantage of the farming communities and the poor. long live capitalism. And so what you're going to see is that Diem is going to basically in 1956 say, you know what, I'm not going to allow elections because I think the communists are going to defraud the election. Now, doesn't that sound familiar, right? That's exactly what we saw happening with Hitler, in Austria. This is kind of the same kind of thing we see happening, with the Soviets saying, oh, we can't allow free elections because, the Americans are going to throw the election. And so this is kind of a same song, different verse, right? And so you're going to see that this refusal to have elections is going to create tensions between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh, for all that he's a communist, is very much dedicated to a unified Vietnam, and he wants Vietnam to be together, and he really is absolutely patriotic towards his country. So part of what's going to happen is that you're going to see there's going to be groups within South Vietnam, these poor people, the people in the rural areas, the Buddhists, that are going to kind of side with the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh, and they're going to form what we call the Viet Cong. Okay, the Viet Cong are essentially South Vietnamese that are fighting for the communists, right? And what you're going to have is really an insurgency campaign. You're going to have, Viet Cong that are causing terrorist attacks, that are setting off explosions, that are, sabotaging things and that kind of thing. And it's going to kind of begin this guerrilla war, right? And so this is going to increase Eisenhower's assistance to South Vietnam. And of course, there again, you're going to have, there's a lot of nastiness going on. This is the problem with these kinds of campaigns. There's not, Diem's regime was not very good. They were corrupt. They tried to dismantle the Buddhist temples in favor of Catholicism. They took advantage. They didn't take care of the natural resources. But Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, while they certainly had this ideal of a united Vietnam, they were not afraid to use terror tactics as well. So part of what they were doing was really pretty awful too, and you can see they assassinated people. So when Kennedy takes over in 61, he doesn't want to be soft on communism, and of course he's facing this whole criticism with the Bay of Pigs and all that kind of stuff. So he increases the aid, right? Increases that. Part of the creation of the Special Forces and the Green Berets is to kind of help in Vietnam, right? To help kind of support Diem and help him be handle the Viet Cong and that kind of thing. So that's really kind of the origin of these special forces. Part of the problem with Diem is that he uses these strategic hamlets, and the Americans early on kind of encouraged this, which are meant to, quote unquote, protect the peasants from the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong. Except what happens is they forcibly move people, right? And think about the Japanese internment camps. How does that work out, right? American Indian reservations. People don't like to be forcibly moved. And the strategic hamlets do that to South Vietnamese, and that creates even more resentment, right? And then he starts really targeting the Buddhist religion, and that upsets a lot of people. You're going to have Buddhist monks who self-immolate, which I think the next picture coming up is a picture of a monk doing that, which basically means they walk into the middle of the street, they dump a bunch of gasoline on themselves, and they light themselves on fire. And it's their way of protesting the injustice of what Diem's doing. So in 1963, right before Kennedy's assassinated, the South Vietnamese generals are really upset with Diem. They feel like his regime is making it harder to handle the Viet Cong, the hamlets, the repression of the Buddhists, and a lot of that especially the repression of Buddhists has to do with Diem's personal beliefs. And so they want to get rid of Diem. They think if they can get somebody else in office that maybe they can calm things down. And so basically the American ambassador kind of gives a nod of the head to an assassination attempt with Diem. And so they overthrow Diem in November 1st, 1963. He's executed. And then, of course, later on in November of 63, on the 22nd, Kennedy's assassinated. And so what will happen is that because of the chaos in South Vietnam, the U.S. has to continue to get more and more involved. We have to send more and more troops, more and more equipment, and it just keeps getting more, right? So this is a picture of a protest, a Buddhist monk setting himself on fire. And when images of this are coming back, this is one of the reasons why the U.S. is going to kind of be like, yeah, maybe Diem's not such a good guy. And of course, this was one of the problems with our Cold War policy, was that we didn't often pay close attention to what, the leaders we were supporting and what they were like and that kind of thing. So LBJ is going to come in 1963. And what you're going to see is that he wants to continue this policy that was begun under JFK. He's not going to back off of communism either, right? He doesn't want to be soft on communism. And understand that he's really pushing through a strong domestic agenda, which we'll talk about later. And that domestic agenda is going to be civil rights, it's going to be social reform, the war on poverty, and all that kind of stuff. So he's trying to push through this agenda. And so this is why he's so, let's just keep sending money and advisors and that kind of thing. And he's really kind of giving the military free rein. So what's going to happen in August of 64 is that you're going to have the Americans and the South Vietnamese are conducting operations in the Gulf of Tonkin. And if you remember the map, that's right by North Vietnam, right? Very kind of a la South Korea, North Korea firing missiles, that kind of thing. So we're conducting these operations, and we get a little bit close to the coast of North Vietnam. And so North Vietnam basically fires a warning shot. Hey, get out of the way, right? You're in the wrong space. And basically, so initially, what this was really much ado about nothing, right? Except the Navy initially gives this report that what had happened was 2 boats had fired on American destroyers. And they say, that this was uncalled for. We weren't in their space. And they didn't fire just 1 shot. They fired 2. And it makes this big deal. They notify LBJ. LBJ immediately orders airstrikes in North Vietnam. How dare they try to fire on us and all this kind of stuff. Well, what turns out happening is that it wasn't really an attack by 2 different attacks. What happens is that the destroyers were there for a bad reason. They were, of course, helping South Vietnamese spy and set up commando raids to disrupt North Vietnam. So we really were in space we weren't supposed to be in. But, of course, LBJ doesn't quite know that when he authorizes this attack. And then they did fire 1 shot, but the second shot was apparently a radio malfunction, right? Kind of like an echo, if you will. And so they only fired the 1 shot. And so by saying that they fired 2 shots, it makes it look like they're being aggressive, when really they're not. They're being defensive. And so all of this kind of happens under false pretenses. So what will happen very shortly after LBJ orders this airstrike? He'll go to Congress and he'll say, we need to do something. We can't let North Vietnam treat us this way, disrespect us this way. They have to respect our military. And he gets the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it's very important that you know the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That authorizes presidents to take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack against the forces of the U.S. and prevent further aggression. And that is basically a blank check. So basically, do anything you want. If you say there's a possible armed attack and you want to protect our forces anywhere in the world, you can do it, right? And so really what you're going to see, and it's a constitutional issue, right? You have these powers of Congress to declare war that we saw in World War II. And they're basically handing that over to the president, saying, Mr. President, if you feel like you need to do something, you go ahead and do it. We're going to back you 100%. And so really that you have this question about the separation of powers there. So it's very important that you understand the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The STAR test likes these kind of double meaning kind of things, like Gulf of Tonkin, where you have a historical context as well as a constitutional context. So be sure you know that. And of course, LBJ's part of why he's able to do this is because of that momentum he has after LBJ, or not after LBJ, after JFK. And of course, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that appearing tough on communism, is going to be a big part for why LBJ is going to win very, very handily in 1964. He's going to walk away with that election. And, there's some Barry Goldwater stuff. Barry Goldwater was the Republican candidate. He talked a lot about nuclear weapons. And again, you see the American public going, we don't like nuclear weapons that much. And so LBJ will win very handily. So he kind of comes in, when you get to 1965, with kind of the sense that he has an endorsement from the American public. And of course, understand that, the American public doesn't know the truth about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, by the time you get to 65, LBJ and his administration know the truth, but they're not telling anybody, okay, which is problem number one with Vietnam. They're not being honest with the American public. And if you think about NSC 68, they say that's one of the key things you have to do with the American public. So by March of 65, the North Vietnamese will attack American bases, and the U.S. will attack back. This is called Operation Rolling Thunder. So from late 64, early 65, you have huge numbers of American troops coming in. And remember, we still have a draft going on. The draft had been in place since World War II. Now, it wasn't super active, right? Because, after Korea, you don't have this need to draft a bunch of soldiers. But most guys, if their number came up, they had to go serve in the military for a little bit. But by 65, they're going to Vietnam, right? And so they start increasing the number of troops that they're drafting and that kind of thing. And so you have the sustained bombing campaign, combat troops, and that's going to start with Operation Rolling Thunder. And again, this is where the idea of domino theory becomes incredibly important. However, right, remember that everything about Vietnam is fuzzy, right? All the ideology is fuzzy, who's the bad guy, who's the good guy, all of that's really fuzzy. And so this is going to really profoundly affect the fighting in Vietnam, because it's not going to be about we're going to go in and defeat North Vietnam, right? We're not there to defeat North Vietnam. We're there to defeat communism, except communism exists in the North and it exists with the Viet Cong. And what do we do if the South Vietnamese aren't very nice and all this kind of stuff, right? And then, of course, the Vietnamese are going to view the American soldiers there as being unwanted guests, right? There's going to be a lot of frustration. So there's a lot of parallels with Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, right? And so that's why this is so incredibly relevant. And so you're going to see that the Viet Cong will use, ambushes, booby traps, guerrilla tactics, and they kind of blend in with the population, right? I mean, there's lots of stories by American soldiers that say, this kid, I was giving him candy and we were laughing and joking, and then the next day I saw him firing on a bunch of soldiers, right? Or he was killed because he was sniping at people. And so you have that. You're going to have the use of napalm and Agent Orange meant to destroy the hideouts in the jungles, right? So there's all this deforestation, which, of course, napalm, if you remember from the firebombing, that has bad results because you can't control where the fire goes. That's going to build resentment. And then the Agent Orange has all these long-term health consequences, not just for the Vietnamese, but for the Americans. And Agent Orange is going to end up with lots of kind of unintended damage to the area, and it's going to really hurt morale for the soldiers as well as for the Vietnamese. And really, this continues to push people into the arms of the Viet Cong. And the Americans continuously underestimate the strength of the Viet Cong, their determination. They underestimate the strength of the Viet Minh. So that's a big part of the problem. And so the American military is going to LBJ saying, just a few more troops, and we can beat them. They're really not that strong. But then that never works, right? And so it becomes this huge problem. And part of the issue, too, is that you have this Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail that goes from China, North Vietnam, through kind of Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. And because under LBJ we don't want to fight with Cambodia and Laos, we're not attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're trying to stop it as it comes into Vietnam. But unfortunately, by then, right, people are able to blend in and go get the supplies they need. And so you have the Viet Cong with this constant supply of weapons. And of course, again, we're going to end up using these hamlets, which, are just not a good way. You can't forcibly move people and monitor people and patrol people for security purposes, right? Things like the My Lai massacre, where you have a bunch of American soldiers killing South Vietnamese. That's what happens when you put people in a neighborhood and you put a bunch of soldiers and guards around them, right? And so this is going to make it very difficult for the soldiers. And this is why you have such bad morale in Vietnam, is because, we're supposed to be here to help, and yet these people clearly don't want us here. They clearly don't like us. They're angry at us. And why do they keep shooting at us when we're just here to try to help, right? Drug usage is going to be a real problem for American soldiers in Vietnam. You're going to have lots of that kind of stuff happening. And Vietnam is going to be very much kind of a proxy war with communism. communism with the Soviets and the Chinese, mostly the Chinese and the U.S. And so that's one of the big things you need to understand about Vietnam. All right, I'm going to hit the stop button because my lunch period's over, and I will record the second part of this next time I get a chance.